Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is another one of our sub episodes, and we paired it very nicely with who is the savior of the Union Army at Gettysburg. This is going to be my analysis and my take personally on who exactly that should be. And obviously, I'm going to make it a little bit more complicated than just giving you a name and, immediately cutting to our outro music. I think that would be a little bit anticlimactic, right? If this episode was just a minute long and, kind of just going off of that. So we will go ahead and actually break it down day by day, have a variety of different factors that I think are important. And if you've been listening to some of these episodes, I bet you can kind of guess what some of those are. And I bet you can kind of guess where I'm going with at least some of this stuff. So shouldn't be necessarily totally a surprise. Maybe it will be. I don't know. But hopefully you find this interesting and maybe it will guide your decision. Maybe you'll agree with me, disagree with me. Again, that's what I think is the great thing about this particular subject and kind of talking about this is that you could have one candidate, multiple candidates. You could have a different take on things. You can look at it as minute, as a detail, or as kind of, taking a look back from a bird's eye view as you want. So I don't necessarily think that there's a right or a wrong answer necessarily. Everyone is entitled to their opinion. And again, that's what I think is the great thing about this subject matter. But before we get into the actual meat and potatoes here, let's talk a little bit about our Patreon content. And we do have an episode that we posted. We looked at some Gettysburg monuments, and we've done monuments before. We've listed some of the top battlefield monuments that I have across all the battlefields here of the Civil War that I personally think are some of my favorites. These are just another couple handful of Gettysburg monuments that I think are particularly memorable. If you think that would be interesting, there is a slideshow up. They're certainly not the monuments. Again, it's kind of like this episode, right? There are certainly other monuments throughout the battlefield that maybe you would have liked to have been included. These are just another list of a good handful of them. So again, it's not a comprehensive list by any means. So we do have other picture slideshows of modern day battlefields. We do have movie reviews. We do have memoir reviews. We're going back to the well of memoir reviews here shortly. This next month, we are doing 13 months in the Confederate Army. That episode will be dropping here as of the first of the month. So we are talking about somebody who didn't necessarily want to serve in the Confederate Army. That's another kind of different look of an individual as we try to cover all different types of corners of soldiers and sailors, even, where we are trying to get a lot of different types of perspectives here. So if that sounds like it would interest you, any of that sounds like it would interest you, there is a link in the show description. Those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. They are greatly appreciated. So the question actually came up recently when I was doing this schedule, and it was sort of a fair question, is why Gettysburg exactly? What is the fascination with this battle? And it was kind of in the context of just Gettysburg in general, but I think it has a lot to do with just the way there is kind of this culture around the battlefield, right? And so I want to kind of talk about that just to begin with before we get into kind of this analysis of who saves the Union Army, because and that's kind of my point, in that we don't often talk about in depth who saves the Union Army at X battle, right? We don't talk about necessarily who is the savior at Antietam, because there's often kind of a back and forth on if Antietam really is a Union victory. I think it is, but certainly there are people who kind of stick to the sort of conventional that it was a draw, more of a pure draw. And part of that, I think, is that you can make an argument that Robert E. Lee does probably have the best performance on the day. But again, that's also up to debate. Certainly, that's kind of my opinion of the matter as well. But since we're kind of having an episode where we're giving my opinion, I'll throw that one out there. But let's take a look at another battle, right? Like Stone's River, let's say. Is Rosecrans really the mastermind of that? Is it George Thomas? Phil Sheridan does a pretty good job of that battle, and certainly we can kind of have that testament of, all of his brigade commanders are either killed or wounded, right, at the end of the day. So is that the guy who's the savior of the Union Army at that battle? And that's also a very important engagement where you just had Fredericksburg. You had the momentum shift to the Confederacy. We talked about this fairly recently in our high level 1862 episode, where you had this kind of general offensive, the closest thing that we can get to a joint offensive for the Confederacy in the fall of 1862. And then the momentum shifts back to the Union, but then you have Fredericksburg, right? And then Lincoln's like, whoa, no, right? I was going to kind of roll out this Emancipation Proclamation, and this isn't good. And so we need a W. And that's why Stone's River is always going to be in the back of Lincoln's mind. And he's always going to have a soft spot for William Stark Rosecrans because he gives them that important victory, right? But we don't really talk about that. We talk about Gettysburg, and we're talking about Gettysburg in this episode. So why is it? There's always this cultural sort of relevance around Gettysburg. We have all these monikers of things like it's the high water mark. It's the largest battle in American history on American soil, right? And that alone probably should be something that we kind of put at the forefront of our minds when we're thinking about Gettysburg. It is arguably the turning point in the war, right? We kind of go back and forth a little bit in this podcast, a little bit about whether it's Gettysburg, if we're looking at 1862, 1863, what is exactly the turning point in the war? Who knows, right? There is kind of a coin flip between those two. Certainly things do not go very well for the Confederacy here in the summer of 1863, and it's kind of capped off, I think, by this huge defeat in terms of Gettysburg, and even in Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia, kind of this known quantity that you think is always going to perform well. Even they're kind of chalking up a loss here. Doesn't really bode well for the rest of the war, right? But there is something to be said in terms of the kind of the grand scale, the casualties, all of that. But then I think also it has something to do with actually going there and the culture of Gettysburg itself. That's just different than other towns that are around battlefields, right? Gettysburg is kind of this epicenter of the Civil War nerd, right? It is the place to go if you like the Civil War. And I think that there is also something to be said for that. You kind of have a different feeling there. You can spend a lot of time there. You can walk around downtown. It's kind of a great downtown. I highly recommend you go and check it out, whether it's the city, whether it's the battlefield. Definitely, if you haven't been there, I can't recommend it enough. And that's kind of also where we're going to have a shameless plug for what we just talked about in terms of our monument slideshow. It has probably the best monuments of, at least in my opinion, battlefield monuments out there, right? And so you have this great mix of that, which is sort of the modern, and you also have this great mix of returning to the past as well, because you have, and really, if you look at, say, Devil's Den, right? This is kind of an observation that I've had over the last couple of years. It's very different from where I went to Gettysburg as a kid, and they've done a lot of work to kind of restore Devil's Den and that surrounding area to make it look like it did back in 1863. And there's really, with the exception, I think, of Second Manassas and the railroad cut, which used to be kind of sort of a forest. And, I'm not necessarily, banging the drum to cut down trees, but you can really understand the topography of the battlefield and how things turned out when it's a huge open field, and really get the idea of the flow of the battlefield a lot better. So I would say that Second Manassas is probably the exception of kind of turning back the clock and making it seem like it did back in the time of the Civil War. You still get that as well. So there's a good mix of the two. And I think that if you combine those factors, there's just something to do with that magic and Gettysburg that it goes beyond just what we can kind of look at on paper and wax poetic about, this is the end of the Army of Northern Virginia as really the premier fighting force or offensive fighting force, I guess you could also say. So just kind of wanted to talk about that a little bit up front here while we have an open platform, I guess we should say, about Gettysburg before we close the book on Gettysburg, I guess, for a little bit as well, because we've had this month of just straight Gettysburg content. But let's go ahead and switch gears and let's talk about who the savior of the Union Army is at Gettysburg, right? So, in my opinion, we have the question that needs to be broken down into a combination of different factors on different days, right? And I think that, and I'm going to kind of go the cop-out route a little bit in that I will pick multiple people. I'll give you multiple people, which is sort of my answer, and then I'll also give you one person as well, so I'll give you both. But I think that if we're breaking it out into and kind of thinking about it in sort of a critical sense, then we need to break it out into 3 days. And there's 3 days of the battle, of course, right, as we know. And those 3 days have 3 pivotal moments, 3 pivotal situations or scenarios that I think are kind of the tipping points or really the important factors when we need to take this question into consideration. So I'll give you the 3, and these are just for me. So these are just ones that I came up with, and this is how I kind of whittled it down. And maybe, again, like I said at the top of the episode, you might have a different idea of what these could be if you're kind of taking the same approach. But on day 1, I think it's terrain selection. On day 2, I think it's troop filtration for the Union. And on day 3, I think it is the artillery or infantry preparation for the assault in the center. So those are kind of like my 3 pivotal situation scenarios that we kind of need to take into consideration and judge off of. So on day 1, if we're going off that as well, so we'll have 3 people for 3 days. On day 1, it should be no surprise, I'm going with John Buford. And you know me, if you've listened to these episodes before, you know I'm a big Buford guy. I think that if you have all these other factors as well, we kind of listed off a lot of individuals for the first day. And it goes back to, choosing where to fight the battle. And if it's Reynolds, if it's Oliver O. Howard, if it's even Hancock, and they're all kind of having that flavor to them a little bit of you're fighting on one side of the town in order to fight it on the other side of the town, which is where you really want to fight it because that's where the advantageous terrain is, right? And you're having that recognition. Well, I think that if we are stripping it down, and maybe it's a situation also of who was the first to have recognized that, and maybe Buford, because he's, the cavalryman here, maybe he is the beneficiary of that. But I think also when we're making the argument for these other individuals, it kind of all goes back to him as well. So that's why I'm giving the nod here to Buford. We also have kind of this added in factor that he's throwing his cavalry into a situation and they're going to perform like infantry in a way that they have not done quite a whole lot of up until this point in the war. And certainly when we get to the end of the conflict, you're going to see more of that, a la Custer, Sailor's Creek, all that we talked about there at the end of the conflict in 1865 is going to be a lot more common, but not quite so common here in 1863. Terrain obviously is very important as the battle unfolds. I think that's also something that people, unless you go to the battlefield, and that's one of the things that I just talked about, right? If you've never been to the battlefield, if you've never walked Pickett's Charge, I definitely also recommend you do that, because if you've ever walked that, then you would realize it's a lot different than just a flat surface, right? It does have a little bit of an incline. So there is a little bit of an importance when it comes to terrain, even on the third day, even on Pickett's charge, right? So there we go. Day 1, we have Buford, and that was, again, terrain selection. Day 2, we're going to go with Winfield Scott Hancock. And remember, day 2 was troop filtration. So when you have Dan Sickles, and he has his famous movement into the peach orchard, and he has this kind of extension of his line, then you have a kind of scramble, mad scramble after that. Meet the needs of the various crisis points all along the Union line. And I think nobody does it necessarily better than Hancock. And he does it multiple times. You know, he's sending Caldwell's brigade into the wheat field. He's sending the 1st Minnesota on their famous charge. He has Willard's brigade as well. Samuel Sprigg Carroll is another brigade that's getting moved around. So we have multiple situations where he is throwing regiments, brigades into situations where they are needed. And he's not the only one. And I think that that's also something that maybe I should also put a little caveat on, is that oftentimes when I talk about Gettysburg on the second day, you would think that maybe the way I talk about it, perhaps, if I'm being a little self-critical, maybe Hancock is the only one who's out there doing things. He's not the only one, but I do think that he is kind of at these crisis points, right? If Cemetery Ridge falls, if the center of that line falls, you know, who's to say Cemetery Hill falls, right? You know, Cemetery Hill, Cemetery Ridge, if those two positions fall, is the Union line tenable any longer? I don't think so. That's at least my opinion on the matter. So you're going to have to probably, if you're Meade, then come up with a different defensive position. And maybe if you're Longstreet, this is another maybe what if scenario. If you're a Longstreet, then maybe you're going to get what you wanted in the first place, which was get the Union Army to move off of where they were in the first place. And obviously you would have had to act offensively to do that. And on the second day, and if you had really driven them there at Cemetery Ridge, always like a good what if, you know, what if Billy Mahone's brigade had been thrown in, is kind of sitting there doing nothing. I bet Rands Wright's Georgians would have enjoyed having Mahone's Virginians helping them out, but that's just me. So there we go. Day 2, Hancock troop filtration. That was for day 2. Day 3, and this is where we're going to pick a dark horse, right? I had to pick a dark horse, and this is where we're going to go Henry Hunt. And in my opinion, if it's not Henry Hunt, it's probably Hancock again, but it boils down to the question of why does the Pickett-Pettigrew-Trimble charge fail? And while I don't presume to have the definitive answer to that question, I'm going to probably lean to the side of holding the artillery fire until the infantry is being launched as probably being a good bet. If that's not the deciding factor, it definitely is adding to the brew of the concoction that will end up being why it fails, right? It's going to be a big part of that, I think. If you are expending ammunition, if you are having this counter battery duel and having your batteries knocked out, then those are situations where the artillery is not helpful against this infantry assault. And if we look at the charge, if we just look at Pickett's division, then we know that these lead brigades, they're not going to be as effective by the time they get to the Union line. And we know that that's why Armistead's brigade is really the only one that's able to then come in, because they've been covered relatively by these lead brigades, and they're able to break the Union line, and there's no follow-up to that. So that's why, in my opinion, Pickett's charge eventually fails, and artillery is a big part of that. So those would be my 3, right? Day 1, day 2, day 3, Buford, Hancock, Hunt. And I don't think that's a surprise necessarily if you've listened to me. A huge surprise probably would have been if I had said Sickles maybe for day 2, right? Or picked up another dark horse maybe. But here we go. If we had to pick one, I don't think it's necessarily a surprise either, but I'm going to go with Winfield Scott Hancock. And no, I'm not picking Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. But not to say that Chamberlain, and we talked about it here last episode, but not to say that Chamberlain's contribution is not significant, but I just think if we look at the battle as a whole, then it has to be Hancock who gets the nod. If we have three pivotal moments, then we can see he's making an impact on all three. We already talked about day 2, so we're going to just skip that one because Hancock day 2, troop filtration, we talked about that already. But let's go back to day 1. Does he have a big impact in selecting the ground? Maybe the same impact that others have? No, but he does defer the situation to others who are familiar at the very minimal. He doesn't mess with what's already unfolding. He does have sort of this carte blanche to do that, and he could kind of throw his weight a little bit more than he does, but he doesn't. So at the very minimal, we can say, like we've said in other battlefield situations, that not messing up is sometimes just as good as having this super stellar performance, right? And this is also what I'm talking about when I mentioned Buford and that argument for day 1, right? Does Hancock really have a huge amount to do with where the battlefield is fought and what terrain that they are choosing? I don't know if that's necessarily true. Maybe he has a little bit to do with that, maybe more than others, but it's not quite the same as Buford being there and being the first one to really select it. Day 3, he's not as involved with the artillery, and actually he's kind of a detriment to the artillery because he kind of gives them the opposite of what they end up doing. But we can say that he does have this nod toward the infantry preparation. We know the Vermont Brigade comes out, hits the Confederates in the flank. That's definitely part of why the attack fails, at least on that end of the attack, the Pickett end. And then we have also on the Pettigrew side of things, the 8th Ohio is coming out. So those are the two kind of flanking movements that we have from these Union efforts. The baseline is that he is versatile in this argument for the 3 days. We can definitely see passively steering, reacting aggressively, and then defending actively. Each one is very different, but overall, I think if you combine those all together and you go and you look through all 3 days, then there you have your answer for me. So once again, there we have it. I have given you kind of my thoughts here about Gettysburg, about here who is the savior of the Union Army here. Gave you my 3 and then also my 1. Maybe you have, again, the similar ideas about things. Maybe you have different. But again, like I said, that's also the great thing about this exercise is that you can have a completely different idea of how we should think about it, how maybe there should be different guys in here, right? Maybe I'm completely wrong with this Hancock idea. You could definitely have that opinion. I think that there's definitely room for that. I also think that there is an exercise that we could do where we can eliminate this thought process of it has to be all 3 days. And maybe we just limit it to it has to be one moment for one of these days. And then we can definitely have a real different exercise there because we can maybe even eliminate Hancock in that sense or eliminate Henry Hunt on the 3rd day if we say that maybe the 2nd day is more important, right? So that could be a very interesting and worthwhile exercise as well if we're just picking one moment, one person. So again, like I said, I think it's a worthwhile thought process. And hopefully you found this interesting. Hopefully you found the previous episode interesting to kind of have all the facts laid out before you and have all of the individuals listed. And maybe I had missed 1 or 2, but we also have, I think, pretty much the main candidates here as well on the episode for you. and then broke it down for you in terms of the thought process for who I figured would be the savior of the Union Army at Gettysburg. Hopefully you've enjoyed this Gettysburg content. I don't think I'm necessarily done with Gettysburg, but good to have gone back to this Pennsylvania town and done a couple of different types of episodes on it. Glad we got to do this, and hopefully we will be back again soon. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to this website as well as Patreon information. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback's always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns, the email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.